Today is day 2 of our Constitutional Convention notes. We're going to focus on looking at the discussion of slavery and whether or not slaves should count in representation, federalism, separation of powers and checks and balances, and the Electoral College. As the Founding Fathers are deciding how to set up the new government, the issue of slavery comes up, but not as one would think. Instead, the big question was, should slaves count in representation? The southern states, like a state like Virginia and South Carolina, had a large slave population, and if counted in the total population count, it would give them more seats in the House of Representatives, which could give the South an advantage in national politics. The North, of course, was against this. Now, keep in mind, there's no debate right now over the morality of slavery in this meeting, even though some of the people there were against slavery. So the solution is what we call the 3/5 compromise. 3 out of every 5 slaves would count towards the state population. This definitely does help the South have a little bit of an advantage in the House of Representatives, and does go away when slavery ends. The other compromise has to do with the international slave trade. There was a big discussion about this. Now, this is not talking about slaves being traded across state lines. That could still happen. This would mean the Middle Passage, slaves coming from Africa, and they decide that they will ban it in 20 years, which would give it an expiration date of 1808, and that does happen. On this slide, we're going to look at 2 more examples of compromising at the Constitutional Convention. As mentioned earlier, one of the big questions is who should have more power? Should the states have more power or should the federal government? Guys, this is still a huge debate today. People argue about this left and right. So this has not changed from the 1780s to 2020. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the states were really powerful. So at this meeting, they're going to be kind of hesitant to give up a lot of power. So you've got to find that happy medium. And the solution is something known as federalism, which is the division of power between the states and federal government. And there will be things that they each can do. So for instance, a state can determine education, a state can determine marriage laws. The national government is the group that's going to coin money. You know, we don't want every state to have their own currency. They're going to run the national military. So big things like that. But then they have shared powers, things that they both can do. So this is an easy one to remember, especially those of you that are working. They both can tax you. They both have their own court system. Okay, so there's different things that they can each do. They both can write their own laws. We have laws in Georgia that are unique to Georgia that other states don't have, and vice versa. So that's what federalism is, the division of power between states and federal government. The second compromise on this page slide has to do with within the federal government who has the most power. And the Founding Fathers were very, very hesitant to give one person or even the executive branch a lot of power, especially with what they had experienced under King George III. So actually, under the Articles, if you remember, there wasn't even really a strong executive branch. There was a president that served for 1 year. So under the Constitution, they decide that they're going to create 3 different branches. And ultimately what we're looking at here is that each branch would have a list of duties that they're in charge of. So just make sure that we understand our branches are the executive, which the head of is the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, that's the House of Representatives and Senate, and then the third branch is the judicial branch, and the head of that branch is the Supreme Court. So each of these branches would have their own things that they could do, and then they could have checks over one another. I'm going to show you a slide in a second that will kind of help explain this. But we get this idea from one of the French Enlightened leaders, Montesquieu. So many of the ideas that are in our core government today come from the Enlightenment. John Locke is heavily influences the writing in the Declaration, for instance. So if we take a look at this slide, this is going to help us explain both the separation of powers and the checks and balances. So you'll see that each of the 3 branches has its own shape, different color. If we look under the president, for instance, it tells us that, you know, what groups make up the executive branch and then some of the rules and responsibilities that they have. So for instance, they can enforce the laws. We also know that the president is head of the military. The legislative branch, they make the laws. And then the judicial branch, they interpret the laws. Okay, so for instance, if a state passes a law and says everyone must have purple hair, the courts can strike that down and say, no, that's not a good law, we're going to strike it down. So that's what separation of powers mean. They each have their own list of like duties and responsibilities. But then they can also check one another, and this is where we get this idea of checks and balances. Our hope in creating the Constitution is that these three branches would each have their own sets of duties and responsibilities, and none would grow really powerful and too dominant. And remember, no one wanted a really strong executive branch. So initially, this branch was really weak, and the legislative branch was actually probably more powerful. Today, I think we would argue that the executive branch is very powerful, but not in our early years. So you'll see that there are these arrows that are drawn to each side. And this is an example of the checks and balances. So for instance, if there's an opening on the court, the president can appoint a person to be on the Supreme Court. But then the legislative branch has to approve that judge. Okay, so everyone has their hands on it. If the legislative branch makes a law, the judicial branch can strike it down. On top of that, if Congress makes the law, the president can sign the law or veto it. So they have final say on the law. So that's a check on them as well. If the president violates a law, okay, then Congress can put them on trial for impeachment. You saw this happen last year. So the legislative branch is the only branch that can remove a president from office. So there's all these different ways to make sure that no one is too powerful, okay, and that's what the checks and balances system is. So as you can imagine, the founding fathers were really hesitant to give one person a whole lot of power after their experience with George III. And there were a lot of discussions about a leader. How do we pick a leader? Who is that leader? What is a term like? Are there term limits? Do we have one leader? Do we have three leaders at the same time? And they went round and round. They would take breaks from this. They'd come back and discuss it, take breaks. And ultimately, they decide that they're going to have one leader for a 4-year term, and at this point there are no term limits. But initially the executive branch was pretty weak. Well, then the next question comes, how do you pick the leader? What are you going to do? And there were some fears that like regional politics would play into place. So Southerners would only vote for Southern candidate, Northerners would vote for Northern candidates, and then also the fear that the average person wouldn't be educated enough to make a decision, an educated decision. And so their solution is the Electoral College, and every state gets a set number of votes. On the slide, you can see that we have 16. It's a combination of the number of House of Representatives and senators. Those are not the people that vote, but typically whoever wins the popular vote in our state gets those 16 votes. You can see on this map from 2016 that Trump won 306 electoral votes. You need 270 today to win, and so he won this election. Clinton won the popular vote, but that's not how you win. You have to win the Electoral College